Hi, everybody. So we're going to do something a little bit different. Rather than giving this lecture during our class time on Thursday, I have some other things that I want to do, and we have a limited amount of time. So what I decided to do is I'm actually just going to do a quick video lecture for you guys. So that way you can have the same benefits of being in lecture with me, but instead we'll have time to do other things in class. So that's why I'm doing things slightly differently this time. So when we left off on Tuesday, we were talking about this concept of new urbanism, principles of new urbanism. We talked about what urbanization is, how cities have grown. We talked about what's going to happen to cities in the future, how they're going to continue to grow, and some of the problems that we see with these types of growing cities. So we're going to kind of move and transition next into a discussion of sustainability. So what does sustainable mean? We've thrown the word around a lot, but we haven't actually sort of defined it. So your textbook defines sustainability as being able to live on planet Earth using specifically renewable resources as much as possible, and not damaging all of the sort of ecological processes that actually support us as humans. So in other words, can we use our resources and still support all the living things on this planet at the same time? That's what sustainable is. Development is anytime we are meeting the needs of people, so improving people's lives. Development would be developing food systems, developing systems for getting clean water, developing housing. So a variety of different things, whatever we need to meet the needs of people. So this concept of sustainable development then is how do we meet the needs of a growing human population now without compromising future generations. So not using everything that's on the planet right now just for us and leaving things for future generations. We want to ensure that our children and our grandchildren and their grandchildren will have a place that they can call home as well, that they will have access to food and water and shelter and space and be relatively pollution free. That's the idea. So then the big question is, can we do it? There's a section of your book that talks about resources and resource economics. And as I mentioned in class yesterday, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about these things simply because, as I mentioned before, this kind of gets into a little bit more information than you actually need. The only thing that we kind of need from this is our definition of resources. And pardon me because I'm not finding where my resources are real quick here. Here they are. The only thing we need to know is our two definitions of resources. And we've talked about this before. This isn't new information. We know that there are different types of resources on the planet that we depend on, those that are renewable and those that are non-renewable. Our non-renewable resources were things that we've discussed, like our fossil fuels. We didn't discuss minerals, but that's another chapter in your textbook. So anything that has to be mined from the ground also is in limited quantity and limited supply. Renewable resources are things that are recycled and replenished at a fairly steady rate. So water, living organisms, things like trees and timber, different sources of renewable energy. We talked about it as well. Those would all fall into our renewable resources category. So sustainable development and sustainability depends on our ability to rely mostly on our renewable resources and protect our renewable resources, and to try to transition away from those non-renewable resources as much as possible. However, our life is dependent right now on those non-renewable resources. So in addition to the fossil fuels that we've discussed, and we know that those are in limited supply in many cases, we also know that certain things like minerals, things that we are mining from the earth, they're also in limited supply. So the only way that we can really continue to use these resources is if we reduce the demand for them. So if we're using less of them, we can stretch out how long we'll have these resources for. We can also recycle things as much as possible. So that kind of got into our discussion of what we do with our waste products. If you remember, I talked about aluminum cans and how recycled aluminum is a lot cheaper than mining bauxite, which is what they use to actually make new aluminum. So when we do things like that, when we recycle these types of resources, it helps to keep the supply of them around for much longer. And then we can also recover more resources. So there is the potential to find new deposits of different types of minerals, or new places where we can find oil reserves or coal deposits or things like that. As our technology improves, we'll be able to find more of these resources. I'm going to skip over this. I'm definitely skipping over natural resource accounting. You don't need to know anything about natural resource accounting. And I'm going to skip to talking about sustainable business practices, mostly green business and green design. So we talked about this in lab. This concept of we can call things green that are environmentally and typically socially sound. So we mostly talked about this in regards to green buildings and green campuses, but this would also include companies. There are plenty of companies who are trying to be more environmentally friendly and more socially friendly. They are sourcing their materials. They're getting their raw natural materials in a way that is less impactful on the environment. They are trying to reduce their carbon footprint, so they are trying to offset carbon emissions. You can do that usually through companies that'll plant trees. So depending on how much carbon you produce, they'll plant an equal number of trees to absorb that carbon. So that's a really easy way to sort of be more carbon neutral. So companies like The Body Shop, Patagonia, Aveda, some of these companies are actively promoting themselves as green companies because there is definitely an interest from buyers. They want to buy from companies who are more environmentally and socially friendly, who are practicing these sustainable concepts. They have what we call a green conscience is another way to talk about it. So using less plastic, producing less waste, offsetting carbon emissions, that's becoming more and more popular with consumers, and companies are definitely getting on board with that idea. So in order to promote more of companies to do this, there's essentially a whole host of different ways that we could create what's called an eco-efficient economy. An eco-efficient economy simply means that we are, again, more interested in being, we're still providing products for people to buy, but we're doing it in a way that is much less environmentally damaging. So we don't use hazardous materials. We measure productivity by how many people are employed. So rather than how many of a product that I can put out and how cheaply and quickly I can put that out, I'm more interested in how many people I'm employing, if I'm paying them a good living wage, and I'm being socially responsible as well. So again, not throwing things away and creating toxic waste, celebrating the abundance of biological and cultural diversity. That simply means that I'm not using materials that come from species that are not necessarily endangered, because that would be illegal, but species whose catches I'm worried about. So this kind of applies a little bit more to specifically the marine industry. If you think about where we're sourcing, where some of our fish comes from, and some of our dyes and perfumes and things like that, we want to make sure that they are coming from places where things aren't, the populations aren't low, or we're not taking advantage of poor countries in order to get our resources. And then, of course, using renewable energy as much as possible. So I'm going to pass that, but that was basically just companies are jumping on to green building design as well. Another important thing to emphasize here is that green business is not just good for the environment, but it's also good for the economy. So we had talked about this when we were talking about solar and wind energy, but we know that these companies, the solar companies and wind energy companies, are actually growing abundantly, and they are providing more jobs right now than in coal-fired power plants, for example. So these are areas where we have a lot of interest as far as is providing and promoting what we're calling green jobs and green businesses. And this is a huge booming industry, not here just in the United States, but also globally. And so this is where there's going to be more job creation in the future versus in those traditional energy sources that we've talked about before. So the challenge then is, in the long term, thinking long term, after everything that we've discussed this semester, sort of this is how we're fitting it all together. So sure, we acknowledge that there's a lot of problems in the world. We acknowledge that not everyone has access to enough food and clean water, and some people have, unfortunately, pollution that they have to contend with, and there's not always as many jobs and things to go around. So when we're thinking about how to best care for the environment and how to be sustainable, people are a big part of this picture. It's not simply, oh, if we get rid of people, the planet will be happy and everything will go back to normal. Maybe, but remember that we're part of this planet too. And so what we want to do is we want to find this balance. We want to find a coexistence. We want to be able to thrive and live and support ourselves, but also to do so in a way that protects our environment, and to make sure that future generations also have access to all of these wonderful resources that we do as well. So there are a host of different ways that we can think about sustainable development. And again, if we sort of have these three circles here that are three different goals we have. So we need to meet basic human needs, right? So food, water, shelter, space. We need to maintain healthy ecosystems, protect biodiversity, and we also need to make sure that we have jobs for people. This is economic growth, this is jobs. So where these three things come together then is this goal of sustainable development. So some of these things that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to use more technology to grow more food and to distribute that food equally and so that people aren't hungry anymore. We're going to need to protect the world's most vulnerable populations. It's a concept called environmental justice. So we want to protect the world's most vulnerable populations. We want to give them a chance to lead healthy, productive lives as well. We want to still be able to have goods and services for people. This is the amenities protection. So we're not saying that you have to give up and stop buying everything and go and live and be hippies. That's not what we're suggesting. That's not sustainable development. You can still have things because we definitely have this consumer culture, but think more carefully about the products you buy. Buy things that can last a really long time rather than our disposable economy right now where we buy things very cheap and we throw them away and we don't think about it. Buy things that you can invest in long term and that you can keep for a long period of time so that you have to buy less things. So all of these things then work together for our model of sustainable development. So other things that we need to do to have a sustainable planet is we need to, again, transition into a low growth rate, or ideally zero growth rate, but even a low stable population would be better. Transition our energy sources to renewables. Again, stop relying on this disposable economy, right? So invest in products that are more environmentally friendly and that will last a longer time. So this is sort of a nice infographic that basically talks about the goals of sustainable development, and this was an agenda that was created by a group of conservation groups and nonprofits and world leaders came together, and they created what's called the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, so which is only 10 years away, which is kind of the scary thing. But all of the ideas here are things that we have discussed. So we're looking at improving people's position in life, making sure that they have food, making sure that they have access to healthcare and education, making gender equality equal, so giving women a voice, especially in impoverished and disadvantaged countries around the world, making sure that sanitation and clean water is available for everybody, making energy affordable, giving people jobs, integrating industry and infrastructure with green technology. So making sustainable cities and communities, reducing income inequalities between different racial groups. So again,